Section 17 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. The Fair Maid with Golden Locks. As it fell upon a time, there lived in Golden Land a beautiful princess, whose hair was like the finest gold, and waved and rippled down her back, and reached the ground, and she was called the Fair Maid with Golden Locks. She always wore a crown of China roses on her head, and dresses of the softest and palest pink, or blue, or white, embroidered over with diamonds, so that wherever she went, and whenever she moved, she twinkled like a laburnum bush covered with dew on a May morning. Now it fell out at this very time that there was a certain king, and as he had heard so much of the Fair Maid with Golden Locks, he sent an embassy to Golden Land to ask her hand. The ambassador arrived in Golden Land with his message, but the princess refused the king's offer. She said she was over young to marry yet. Then the ambassador set off sadly on his way home. When he arrived in the city where the king was waiting impatiently for him, everyone was much disappointed because he returned alone, for everyone had expected he would have brought with him the Fair Maid with Golden Locks to be their queen. Now there was at the court a young man who was very clever and very handsome. His name was Charming. Most people liked him, and he was a favorite with the king, but for that very reason several of the courtiers were envious and sought his destruction. One day Charming said without consideration that if he had been sent to Golden Land, he would not have returned with a refusal. This was quite enough for his enemies. They at once went to the king and said, "Charming has been talking in a very insolent manner. He says he is such a good-looking fellow that Princess Goldenlocks would never have refused him." When the king heard this, he was inflamed with rage and gave immediate orders that Charming should be thrown into prison and fed with only one slice of bread without butter on it, and plain water every day, till he grew old and gray and ugly. So the guards seized on Charming and carried him away to the dungeon. There he lay for many days on straw, and ate only the piece of dry bread, and drank only the pipkin of water allowed him. One day he said sadly to himself, "How is it that I have offended the king? I am his most faithful servant, and have done nothing against him." The king chanced to be walking by the tower when he said this, and he overheard the words of Charming. The enemies of the young man tried to make him walk on and disregard what he had heard, but the king insisted on Charming being brought before him. The young man was released, and bending on one knee, he kissed the king's hand and asked how he had offended. "You made a mock of me and my ambassador," said the king, "and you declared that if you had been sent, you would not have returned without the Fair Maid with Golden Locks." "No more would I," answered Charming. "I would have made such a description of your majesty that the princess would have been all impatience to jump into your majesty's arms." The king now saw that Charming had been evil and falsely spoken of. He took the young man back into his favor, and said to him, "So be it. You shall go on an embassy to Golden Land, and if you return without the princess, I will cut off your head." Charming said he was content to run the risk. The king desired to give him a fine equipage and many servants and heralds to blow trumpets before him, but Charming said that all he wanted was a good horse, and to take with him his little dog Dulcet. So next day he started at early dawn and rode all alone, save that his little dog Dulcet ran beside him. Charming carried with him a notebook, and whenever a happy thought struck him which could go into his description of the king he was going to give to the fair maid with golden locks, he got off his horse, sat down, and wrote it, for fear of forgetting it. He wrote, "My master the king is a very great lord. His stomach is round, and his shoulders are broad." "That goes splendidly," said Charming, and he rode on a little way. Then a new idea struck him. He got off his horse and wrote, "His temper is high, but his mind it is low. He croaks when he talks, like a carrion crow." Then he got on his horse again. After a while he thought of some more words in commendation of the king, so he got off and wrote, "His great mustaches they twist and twirl, to win the heart of each right-minded girl." Once, as he was sitting by the water, trying to find a rhyme to bandy legs, and sorely troubled because he could not make a suitable line ending in eggs, a little golden carp that was rising after a fly sprang out of the water and fell in the grass beside him, and remained panting, unable to return to its proper element. "Poor little fish," said Charming. He put his hand down, took the carp, and threw it back into the water. The carp was delighted to be again in the refreshing coolness of the water. She swam up to the bank and said, "Thank you, Charming, for what you have done. You have saved my life, and when you need my help, I will give it to you." Another day, as Charming was riding along, he saw a raven in great distress. It was pursued by an eagle that would have devoured it, had not the young man quickly discharged an arrow from his bow and killed the eagle. The raven perched on a tree, nodded its head, and said, "Thank you, Charming, for what you have done. You have saved my life, and when you need my help, I will give it to you." Night came on, and Charming rode through a wood. The moon shone as clear as the day, and painted the ground silver where it pierced between the branches and leaves. Presently Charming saw what seemed to him a great lump of snow, but it was making a great noise. He went up to it and found that it was a white owl caught in a gin. Charming at once released the poor bird, and the owl hopped onto a branch and said, "To who?" "Do you ask to whom you owe your release? To me, Charming," answered the young man. "You should speak good grammar, and say to whom, and not to who." "Thank you, Charming," said the owl, "for what you have done. You have saved my life, and when you need my help, I will give it to you." These were the only 3 adventures of any importance that befell Charming on his way to Golden Land. When he arrived at the palace of the princess, he saw how magnificent it was. Pearls seemed to be as plenty as pebbles, and diamonds as common as dust. He thought to himself, "If the princess consents to leave all this and come with me to marry my master, I shall be much surprised. And yet, his great mustaches they twist and twirl, to win the heart of each right-minded girl." When he appeared before the princess, his little dog Dulcet would come in with him. He was so well dressed and so handsome that the guards saluted him respectfully, and a messenger was sent to the princess to announce the arrival of another ambassador. The princess was vexed. However, she consented that he should be allowed an audience. Then Charming approached her throne, bearing himself modestly and showing the profoundest respect. When he looked up, he was so struck with her beauty that he put his hand over his eyes as though dazzled. She was in one of her most beautiful dresses, and was covered with rosebuds. Then she graciously bade Charming approach, so he kneeled on one knee and gave her an eloquent description of his lord and master. My master the king is a very great lord. His stomach is round, and his shoulders are broad. His temper is high, but his manners are low. He croaks when he talks like a carrion crow. His great mustaches they twist and twirl to win the heart of each right-minded girl. He has a nose in the midst of his face, and a couple of ears in their proper place. His eyes are round, and his mouth is wide. What more would have an exacting bride? That will do, said the princess. You are so amiable and so eloquent that I would gladly oblige you and marry such a beautiful and interesting king. But I must tell you that I have promised not to marry till I receive a ring which I lost a month ago. I was walking by the riverside when I chanced to draw off my glove. In doing so, I slipped a very valuable ring off my finger, and it fell into the water. I cannot think of listening to any proposal of marriage till that ring has been restored to me." Charming was much surprised at this declaration. He bowed and begged the fair maid with golden locks at least to accept the little dog Dulcet he had brought with him. She replied that she did not want any presents, and dismissed him. All night long Charming tossed on his bed and lamented. "How am I to find the ring that fell into the river a month ago?" said he. "It is not possible. I shall lose my head." Dulcet heard him, and said, "My dear master, do not despair. Let us at all events try what we can do. We will go down tomorrow morning to the riverside and peer into the water." Charming thought this absurd. He gave the dog an impatient slap. At first glimmer of dawn, Dulcet began to frisk about, and insisted on making his master come out with him and walk by the riverside, and there they wandered up and down, but could see no ring in the water. Charming had almost made up his mind to return to his lodgings when he heard his name called. He looked about, but saw no one. Then he walked on, but again heard a voice that called, "Charming, Charming." "Who calls me?" he asked. Dulcet, who was very small and ran close to the water's edge, cried out, "Master, I see a golden carp coming." And sure enough, there was a carp, and it said to the young man, "You saved my life in the meadow where grew the poplar trees, and I promised to repay you. Take this, it is the ring of the fair maid with golden locks." Charming took the ring out of the carp's mouth with many thanks, and he and little Dulcet, which gambolled and barked about him, returned to the palace. Someone told the princess that he was asking to see her. "Ah, poor fellow," said she, "he desires to say good-bye." Then Charming entered, and making a profound bow, approached. He gracefully bent his knee, and handing her the ring, said, "Madam, I have done your bidding. Here is what you had lost. Now will you marry my master, who is the greatest king and most attractive man in the world. His great mustaches they twist and twirl to win the heart of each right-minded girl. He has a nose in the midst of his face and a couple of ears." "Enough," said the princess. "I have heard that already, and would really be moved to accept the king by the eloquence of your speech and the melodiousness of your lines, but that I am determined not to marry anyone so long as I am pestered with the addresses of an ogre named Galifron, who eats human beings as a monkey eats chestnuts. Before I can listen to your proposal, you must kill Galifron and bring me his head." Charming bowed profoundly and said, "Madam, I can at least die in your cause." This was said so gracefully that the princess was moved with pity, and said all she could do to dissuade Charming from attempting to fight the giant. But it was of no use, and he went forth, obtained suitable armor, and mounting his horse, rode in the direction of Galifron. Everyone he met told him what a terrible ogre Gallifron was, and nobody dared go with him as a guide. However, Dulcet frisked at his side and said, "Dear master, whilst you are aiming at the monster's breast, I will bite his shins, and when he stoops, you can deal blows at his head." Charming praised the little dog's plan, but had no great opinion of its success. At last he drew near to the ogre's castle, and saw that all the ground about it was strewn with bones. Presently he heard Gallifron coming. His head was taller than the highest tree. As he came on, he roared like a bull. "I gobble them up, both old and young, garoo, garoo, garoo. If old and tough, they are better hung, garoo, garoo, garoo. If young, at once I snap off the head, garoo, garoo, garoo. I'm never happy but when full fed, and now I will dine on you." Charming, with great spirit, answered him, "Don't count your chickens before they are hatched, nor sell your pullets before they are catched. There's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and to catch a sparrow you'll even fail, till a pinch of salt is dropped on its tail." The grammar was not perfect. Charming ought not to have said catched, which was vulgar, but caught would not rhyme with hatched. Besides, he was too frightened to be in a truly poetic mood. Gallifron was very furious, and he roared and rushed at Charming, swinging his iron club, and would certainly have killed him had not at one and the same moment Dulcet flown at his shins and bitten them, and a raven darted down out of the rock and pecked at the giant's eyes, and beat his face with its great black wings. Consequently, his blows fell harmlessly upon the air, and Charming, rushing in, gave him strokes on his knees, which brought him to the ground, and then, standing over him, he hacked off his head. Then the raven croaked out, "You see I have not forgotten the kindness you once showed me. Today I have fulfilled the promise I made to repay you." Charming thanked the raven with all his heart, and then, mounting his horse, he rode away with the giant's head at his saddle bow. On reaching the capital, the people came out in crowds and welcomed him and shouted with joy, and the church bells rang out merry peals. The princess asked the meaning of this, and was told that Charming had killed Gallifron, and was returning unhurt, bearing his head. Charming now requested an audience, and the fair maid with golden locks could not refuse it. He entered with many bows, and kneeling at the foot of the throne, put down the ogre's head at her feet. "Madam," said he, "I have accomplished the task you set me, and now let me hear that you will listen to the suit of the most accomplished and powerful of kings. My master the king is a very great lord. His stomach is round, and his shoulders are broad. His temper is high, but his manners are low. He croaks when he speaks." "That will do," interrupted the princess. "I have no doubt that the king is all you have depicted him in your resounding verse. But I have, you must learn, the greatest horror of growing old and ugly. Therefore I have determined most decisively never to marry till I can take with me a phial of the water of perpetual beauty. This water has the most marvelous properties. Beautiful things never decay and wither, and ugly things become beautiful when washed with it. If anyone is young, he never wears old if washed with it, and one who is old can be renovated with it to look perfectly young." "Princess," said Charming, "you, at least, need never employ this water, but I am an ambassador who must do all I can to obtain your hand for my master. Will it please you to tell me where this water is to be found?" "It is at no great distance from this," said the princess. "It flows out of the rock at the bottom of a deep and gloomy cavern, and is guarded by 2 dragons with fiery eyes, who will allow no one to pass them." "Madam," said Charming, "I fly to my death. My death will be sweet, because dying for you." When Charming had departed, the fair maid with golden locks said to her ladies, "Surely he will never undertake this adventure. I would not have him die for worlds. I only said it because I really have no heart to marry his master." She was extremely concerned when she heard that he was already departed in quest of the water of perpetual beauty. Charming went on his way, taking Dulcet alone with him. When he came within sight of a great black mountain, then he knew he was not far distant from the fountain. He dismounted and turned off his horse to graze, and let Dulcet amuse himself with catching flies. He went forward and soon saw the mouth of the cavern, from which issued puffs of smoke with flames. This was caused by the breathing of the dragons who guarded the fountain of the water of perpetual beauty. He approached as near as he dared, and saw the hideous monsters spotted black on yellow, writhing about the coils of their slimy and monstrous bodies. Charming had brought with him a flask. He now drew his sword and resolved to penetrate into the cavern and get the water, or die in the attempt. At that moment he heard a voice calling, "Charming, Charming!" "Who calls me?" asked he, looking round. Who, who, was the answer. "Exactly what I want to know," said Charming. Then he saw a white owl sitting among the rocks. The white owl said to him, "You saved my life when I was in the gin. Now I will do all I can to repay you. Trust me with the file. I can thread the interstices of the rocks and penetrate to the bottom of the gloomy cavern, and shall fill the flask from the fountain of perpetual beauty for you." Charming was only too glad to give up the file, and the owl flitted with it into the cavern without either of the dragons caring to stop her, even if they noticed her, for bats and owls were the common inhabitants of such places. Presently she returned with the phial filled with the limpid and sparkling liquid. Charming thanked her with all his heart, and joyfully hastened back to the capital town. He went straight to the palace and presented it to the princess. She could not now make any further excuses, and she prepared to go with Charming to marry his master the king. But, in her heart, she would much rather have had Charming as her husband. At last they reached the king's great city, and he came out to meet the princess, and escorted her to his palace with a great retinue, and a magnificent marriage was celebrated. Then the fair maid with golden locks told the king of all that Charming had done, how he had recovered her ring that had been lost, how that he had slain the ogre, and how that he had obtained for her the water of perpetual beauty. Now Charming's enemies were jealous of him because he had succeeded so well, and especially the ambassador who had failed was so filled with envy and spite that he resolved on Charming's destruction. So he went to the king and said, "I suppose that the fair one with golden locks is often talking to you of Charming." "Certainly she is," answered the king. "It is very clear," said he, "that she thinks more of him than of you." "Yes," said another, "and Charming has been saying that your majesty was too great a coward to face the ogre, or to get into the cavern where were the dragons, and too stupid to find the ring, and so you sent him." "Did he say that?" exclaimed the king. "Throw him into the lowest dungeon." So they took Charming, who had served his master so faithfully, and shut him up in prison. And he had none with him save his little dog Dulcet, and with the dog he shared his bit of bread and sup of water, which was all the nourishment that was allowed him. When the fair queen with golden locks heard what had been done, she cast herself at the king's feet and implored him to set Charming free, but the more she entreated, the more stubborn he became. Now it happened that the king took it into his head that if his queen washed herself with the water of perpetual beauty, he might just as well do the same himself, and then he would always remain young and lovely. So he went into her room, where he knew the phial was standing on a shelf. It had fallen out, however, that one of the queen's maids had been chasing a spider in that boudoir, and in trying to kill it, had upset and broken it and spilled all the precious water. Not knowing what else to do, as she was not an honest girl who had the courage to speak the truth and tell what she had done, she swept the bits of broken glass together, and then remembering that there was a phial very similar in the king's room, also filled with clear water, she went there, and without saying a word to anyone, took this and put it on the shelf in the queen's room, precisely where had stood the flask that contained the water of perpetual beauty. Now the water in this bottle was used by the king for getting rid of those people in his realm whom he desired to destroy without a fuss and a trial. It was a most deadly poison, and if a face were bathed in this water, he who was thus washed shriveled up and died on the spot. The king went into the queen's boudoir, and seeing the phial on the shelf, immediately took it, poured out some of the water into the hollow of his hand, and bathed his face with it. He at once fell down, withered up, and was dead. There was, as may well be guessed, great confusion in the palace when the tidings spread that the king was dead. Dulcet ran to the queen, plucked at her skirts, and bade her not forget Charming. So she sent for the jailer and bade him immediately knock the chains off the hands and feet of the prisoner. There was a grand funeral for the king, and then, as there was no heir to the kingdom, and the nobles and council thought it would be well to keep the two kingdoms united, they resolved that the fair queen with golden locks should reign over both, and that she should choose a husband who should be king over both the realms. When she heard this, then she said that she would not choose anyone else but Charming. Everybody was delighted that he should be sovereign, and the wedding, which took place after a decent interval for mourning over the death of the king, was as splendid as can well be imagined. Notes: The Fair Maid with Golden Locks. This capital story is by Madame D'Aulnoy, but is not wholly original. She has made use of the favorite tale of the Thankful Beasts and the story of the Tasks, and has welded the two happily together. The Tasks are introduced into Cupid and Psyche. End of section 17. Recording by Jeff Cahill.